Don't look now, but it's the middle of September and fishing can be challenging in the late summer, early fall. We're going to talk about how we counter some of that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey there, thanks for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and I appreciate you tuning in as always. We also appreciate the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 140 plus stores nationwide. Also, for you Colorado thinkers considering Toyota products, don't forget about the fine folks at Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado. They've provided all of our trucks for the last almost 20 years now. Great dudes. They love to fish. They have boats. Great company to work with. Guys, it's the middle of September. It's a tricky time to fish. I'm not going to lie. I'm distracted personally by the fact that it's also time to fill the freezer. And I know probably a lot of you are fishermen that like to hunt or vice versa. I am for sure in that category. And so I've already been out shooting some doves and doing some deer scouting, things like that, but it's still fishing season, still nice weather. In fact, it's going to be in the 80s today, a little breezy. Seems like a nice time to be on the lake, but I'm not going to lie to you, this is not my favorite time of year to fish. And I think realistically, it's almost it's a real short period right here where it's not still summer, where they're in their summer period, summer patterns, a lot of offshore fish, things like that. It's not really fall yet, in that we're just starting to get some leaves changing and water temperature's cooling, but it hasn't really fundamentally cooled. We haven't had any real hard cold fronts yet. And therefore the fish are kind of in limbo. They're not really ready for fall. They're not in their summer thing anymore. Similar to the deer, which made me think of this podcast. I just had a group of mule deer come through a few minutes ago. And they're all got their winter coats, but they still got a bunch of summer guard hairs sticking out of them. So they definitely are hung in that transition period. They don't look like the mule deer of fall just yet. The fundamental difference in them, if you're not around mule deer a lot, is huge. A mule deer in the summertime, they look extremely skinny. Everyone that comes to my house and sees them is like, oh, geez, they're starving. No, that's what they look like in the summer because they don't have any hair. Or very little hair, but in the winter they get a big thick coat and all those long tan summer guard hairs go away, and instead they get nice gray mule deer like we're all used to seeing on people's walls. Well, right now they're hung in limbo, just like the fish. And basically what it does is it makes fishing very inconsistent. So I thought over the course of this podcast, I'd talk about a couple key things that I look for when we're out fishing this time of year. Make no mistake, I'm going to fish 3 days this coming week on a film trip, and I'm going to fish 3 days the following week also on a film trip. So I'll be visiting fisheries I haven't been to at a tricky time of year. So what that means is I need to really focus on some key things. So I thought I'd go through a couple of things that I will try to be focused on that will help me be consistent. And this is for multi-species. This isn't just for bass or walleyes or trout. It's multi-species angling wherever we go. And so I thought I'd go through the little scenarios, kind of if-then logic kind of thing. First of all, what I want right now, and this is the only time of year that I really want it, is a cold front. I want a hard cold front to come through, and I mean a hard cold front. Like we're in the 80s today. The high is supposed to be in the 50s on Sunday. Well, that's going to bode well. I think that'll make a big difference. But a real hard cold snap in early fall will definitely spur the bite going. Just the polar opposite of what it will do in the springtime. You get a cold front in the springtime and it'll shut everything down because the fish are wanting a warming trend in the spring. Well, now, I don't know that they necessarily want the wintertime to come, but it will remind them that it's coming, and they will definitely get going. So the first thing I want to try to do is fish right around a big cold front in this time of year, and the bigger the better. And if it comes with some moisture, that's cold moisture especially, even better. So fundamentally, I guess what I'm saying is I want the water temperature to have a sudden drop in temperature, right? I want it to go from, my home lake right now is in the high 60s to 70 degree range, depending on where you are in the lake. I'd like to see that thing drop about 3 or 4 or 5 degrees in a 1 day or 2 day period. And as soon as things start to stabilize a little bit, right after that, the fish will go absolutely crazy and we'll be able to catch them. So one of the things I'm looking for, and if I'm planning a trip, is to go as best I can right around a big cold front. And that's not going to matter what species you're dealing with. And we were dealing with trout this last week in the high country. In some areas where brown trout spawn heavily, and we're up there checking for pre-spawners. And bottom line, there were none, or very, very few. The ones that we saw were just starting to get really kyped up. They're just starting to get their colors, and these brown trout just weren't really there yet. Another couple weeks or one big cold front will change a whole bunch about how their mindset is in relation to their fall spawning ritual. Same thing with brook trout. Conversely, bass, and we've got bass out here right now, or not conversely, concurrently, we've got bass out here right now, some of which are still 40 feet down on summertime haunts. We've got others that are running flat banks right now. And so we get a big cold front, there's going to be a whole bunch of them that will start looking for all that bait fish up high in the water column. And at the same time, that'll spur all that bait fish activity. And I'm just starting to see some schools of shad that are daisy chaining up in the backs of pockets. Daisy chaining meaning they get grouped up and they swim in circles. They're typically young of the year shad. I'm not sure why they do that. I'm not an expert on that. In fact, if somebody's got a really good book on bait fish or a good resource for bait fish habits and identification, I would love to know that. I'm of the opinion that a really concise, well-written book that talked about the habits of bait fish, if you learned all of those things, you'd be better off. But one thing I can tell you is, or I'd be better off anyway, but one thing I can tell you is that they definitely in mid to late September, early October, we'll start seeing a bunch of them that are about 2 inches long. They'll be in real shallow water, and bass will make their way in there to get them. When we get a cold snap, it's not so much they'll be in the shallow water, but they'll be near the surface, and you'll start seeing birds feeding on them, which is another thing I look for a lot in the fall. I follow birds a lot more in the fall than almost any other time. I also follow birds during times of rising water. And when I say follow birds, I mean birds that are actively feeding, not roosted up seagulls or whatever. I'm talking about herons that are working down the bank. I'm talking about kingfishers that you'll hear with their distinctive call. They'll be in the trees and they'll drop straight down and right back in. Those fish need shallow bait to survive. So wherever they show up, or excuse me, those birds need shallow bait to survive. So wherever those birds are, you can rest assured they're shallow bait. And given that fall is coming and hyperphagia, which is the fall feeding binge, is starting to set in, well, that should tell you right there that it's time for fish just to locate that easy to catch bait. And bait in shallow water is easier to catch, or bait up against the surface is easier to catch. So for those of you that like white bass or wipers, this is again one of my favorite time of years as soon as we get these big cold fronts. Right now they're still scattered, but when we get some big cold fronts, the bait fish will be high in the column and the wipers will get them. My two favorite times to chase white bass and wipers are when there's spawning bait, which typically occurs in spring. For instance, shad on a dam somewhere, which if you're a fan of Fishful Thinker, you know we film that every single May. We go out somewhere in Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, New Mexico, whatever, and we will film somewhere where shad are spawning or alewives are spawning or something like that. And it's almost always on a dam face somewhere. That's a great time to catch them. Well, the other great time to catch white bass and wipers and others as well is when the bait fish are up high in the water column and fall and they start dying off when the cold hits them, and then everyone will start, you either catch them on top waters or you catch them on things like jig and spoons as they die off and flutter down through the water column, and the bait and the sport fish are ready to get them. But that's another thing that I will look for is bait fish on the surface. Typically the easiest way to find them, if you don't actually see them dimpling, like today we have a breeze, I know there's some bait fish high in the water column over deep water, like hundreds of feet deep, but the bait fish are right on the surface. I know that because I was watching seagulls pop, and when I use the term pop, when seals are popping is when you see them bobbing up and down, where they fly up but not very far, they're looking around, and then they'll drop right back down on the water, and they're just grabbing those bait fish. Same thing with white pelicans here in the West. White pelicans, they are very good at finding shallow bait. So it's easier for me to sit in the boat with a pair of binoculars and look around the lake than it is for me to try to drive all over the lake and locate fish with my sonar in a lot of scenarios. So the birds will be a telltale thing, and I will follow them a lot at this time of year. When there's a bunch of birds in the back of a creek arm somewhere or a pocket somewhere, you can count on the fact that there's going to be some mature fish in there feeding. Same thing with the seagulls out on the main lakes or out in the main basin of lakes, depending on where you are. Same kind of thing there. So that's another thing I will look for to help me clue me in as to where I might find fish. Because at the end of the day, fall fishing is all about finding the bait. The problem is, which bait are you looking for? And that's a whole nother thing. I've done whole podcasts on that, because the fall feeding binge could revolve around crayfish, or it could revolve around insect hatches, or it could revolve around bait fish, as I've already talked about. So, and it could involve different kinds of bait fish. So maybe it's not just the shad. My home lake, shad's a main bait fish, but so are smelt, and so are baby bluegills and baby crappies and baby green sunfish and yellow perch and all the rest of them. So which bait you're looking for is the conundrum, but that's a much broader topic, and the easy way for me to address that is to use the birds, right? The herons may be feeding on any of the sunfish family, in fact, they're most likely are, or the yellow perch, things like that. Even young of the year smallmouth, there's tons of little smallmouth bass in super shallow water right now. And so they may be feeding on that, whereas the seagulls and the pelicans are more doing damage on the shad and the smelt that are high in the water column out in the main lake. So at any rate, you're looking for bait of some sort. And that bait will be the most active after we get a hard cold snap that will kill some of them and will spur everybody on. In the same way that it'll get deer going, it'll get bears going, it'll get everybody kind of teeing off here for hyperphagia. But we need that first real hard cold front. The other thing that I will look for a lot, changing gears almost completely at this time of year, is an easy one to keep track of stuff, is following your vegetation. So if you're fishing water that has good aquatic vegetation, then you can narrow some of your water down by finding the healthiest, greenest of that vegetation, because as that vegetation starts to die, whether it be from falling water levels, which are very common this time of year, or a cooling of the water, or the plants just being annuals that bloom and then die, and they'll go from there. The vegetation has died off, and the dead vegetation is to be avoided, if at all possible, in almost all scenarios, because what happens is, as that vegetation dies and starts to decay, it will rob the water of dissolved oxygen, because the decay process requires oxygen, and it puts out CO, which we don't want. We get the opposite of nice green plants that are making oxygen for us. I said that wrong. It doesn't put off CO. That is not correct. I said that completely wrong. It puts off carbon dioxide instead of O2 or oxygen, and I apologize for that. But at any rate, the point being is the off gas from dying vegetation, to be clear here, the off gas from dying vegetation robs the water of dissolved oxygen, versus a nice green vegetation produces dissolved oxygen, which the fish will want. So if your whole lake is full of vegetation and it's all still green, fish could be wherever, but as that vegetation starts to die, then you can write it off, and you can effectively make your fishery smaller and smaller as the vegetation dies more and more. So that's something that we will look for a lot of the time. If I put the boat in the water and there's, and I run to some bay that I expect there's going to be a bunch of bait fish in, and the vegetation is dying, particularly if it gets that kind of cheesy looking stuff on top, I will definitely not fish there, or at least I will maybe very quickly look through there, maybe make some exploratory casts, but I'm not going to spend any time there. Typically, if I get around nice green vegetation, I'm going to have my best luck. And we experienced some of that in Minnesota even 10 days ago, which Minnesota being farther north, maybe a little farther along than I am here in Colorado. but we got around some vegetation that was dying and yucky, and our bite just died. We'd been fishing down a weed line, it was going fine, then all of a sudden the vegetation in this one little pocket started to die, and it looked bad, and just about the time we all realized how bad it looked, we also realized we hadn't had a bite in 15 minutes with 3 of us fishing, when we'd been previously catching one about every 5 minutes between the 3 of us. So that was a very clear indicator that the dead vegetation was an issue, and that's something that will get more and more pronounced as we go farther into the fall. So that's something else that I will look for to help keep me consistent this time of year. Another thing that I'll look for a lot at this time of year, particularly when it comes to trout, is that I will start fishing around boat ramps even more than I normally do. And I always fish around boat ramps. But if you're fishing somewhere where trout are stocked, from about the end of September through about the 1st of March is, in my experience, the best time to really target them around boat ramps. And I think it's because most of the trout that are stocked are rainbows. They're in their, they'll be full of eggs. I've caught rainbows full of eggs in January and February as they're getting ready for their spring spawn. And I think they just return to the boat ramps in the same way that salmon return to whatever river they came from. But at my lake, they stock trout at 2 of the 3 boat ramps, and both of those boat ramps will fish well for trout, but not the other boat ramp, which is actually in a really good spot normally for the rest of the year, which tells me that it is the return of the trout going to where they were dumped in the lake more than the boat ramp itself or something to do with the boat ramp. In terms of the 3 boat ramps on my lake, the one that fishes the best 90% of the time fishes the worst for trout through the winter, and that's because they don't stock them there. So that's a key thing there. But I will fish boat ramps a lot because there'll be a certain percentage of trout that will show up there, and they'll feed, and it may be within a couple hundred yards of the boat ramp all the way around. It may not be like I talk about fishing boat ramps for bass or walleyes where you're literally right on the ramp, on the concrete. Trout move around more than that, and therefore they'll be maybe out in front of the boat ramp 100 yards, a couple hundred yards. They might be on the ramp itself at times. I've seen times where you can literally stand on the ramp in the clear water and you'll see them cruising on the ramp. So they will definitely show up at the boat ramp. So that's another thing that I might fish more of at this time of year. And again, when it comes to trout. Another thing that I'll fish a lot this time of year that I'll concentrate on more than I will in the summertime, but again, it's a thing that is common, is riprap. I love to fish riprap. Riprap, of course, being big pieces of broken concrete. Could be sidewalks, old boat ramps, whatever. Riprap also can be rock, just big pieces of rock that they broke and they put together. In the case of dam faces, things like that, rock face dams. But that riprap or broken rock or concrete will hold heat. And so as the water cools, the fish can take advantage of the cooling trend, but themselves being cold-blooded, that little bit of heat on there on the rocks can be good, and that gets better once you get the harder cold snaps, once we get a little bit of cold water. And incidentally, that works even better in spring as they're looking for warm water. But riprap for me is for sure an early spring, mid to late fall thing, very, very commonly, and I will fish it every time because of that. So riprap's another thing that I'll look for in this time of year. Something else I'll throw out there for September fishing could be this. You need to fish with an open mind. And I say that a lot, and it almost becomes redundant. But in fall, even more so, it's because you still have typically the falling water that forces you to be open-minded in the summertime because fish move. But now you also have water temperature changes. And at night, the water temperature is going to cool, and it may warm a little bit more during the day. So your fish may be a little bit more mobile in the first place. Meaning that they're covering a little bit more water. The second thing is that mobility may have something to do with them looking for various bait fish, and they're out actively feeding in the same way that, say, deer in the summertime are pretty lazy. They have a life of luxury. The does don't move around a whole lot because they have fawns. The bucks are just locked down getting fat. But by fall, they'll start moving around. Some of that for food, some of that for mating. Well, same thing with the trout or the fish. Some of it will be mating thing, some of it will be a food thing, but they will be out and on the move more, which means where you caught them may not be where they are, yesterday where you caught them may not be where they are today, or conversely, even over the course of a morning. And that's a big one. So, for instance, riprap. I was just talking about riprap. If you've got some cold, you get a hard cold overnight, and then the sun comes up and it starts cooking this riprap, and you're like, oh, I'm going over there. That riprap's warm. Well, that riprap might take a little bit of time to actually get warm. And then once it does is when the fish will feel it and feel the difference in water temperature. And if you got to get right up on it, I've tested this in the boat with an actual thermometer, not my built-in ones. You've got to get within about 3 or 4 feet of the rocks before you'll notice any difference in temperature of the water around it. It's really localized. It's not out 20 feet off the rocks, but that little band of warm water right on the rocks may be what the sport fish want, but more importantly, it may be what the bait fish want. And regardless, it's going to get the sport fish there. And that's a key thing. So I will like to fish when it gets cold. I'll start fishing afternoons, which seems counterintuitive considering I'm saying we want a cold front. But we want the cold front to set their mindset and to cool some water temperatures. But over the course of a day, the micro difference would be that the water will warm over the course of the day. Same thing in early spring and fall. I like the afternoons, late fall. I like the afternoons more than I do mornings. And to be honest with you, I'm not a morning person, so that's, particularly in spring, that's one of my favorite aspects of spring. For a guy who's a professional outdoorsman and has been for 2 decades, never really been a morning person. I do it, don't get me wrong. But in the spring, when it's cold first thing in the morning, it doesn't bother me at all to sleep in and then go fish in the afternoon when half the other boats are already gone because the fish are more active in that warm water in the afternoon. And same thing can happen in fall after we get some hard cold fronts. And again, we haven't had those cold fronts yet, which means fishers, it depends on how you want to fish. I can go out on my home lake right now and I can fish 50 feet down and I can catch bass and I can also catch them on the bank. Same thing with walleyes, same thing with trout, because we haven't had that temperature change. But once we get it, that's going to be a big difference. The other thing that I'll throw out, and this one's a little bit unique because you have to be a trout guy. But I know I have a lot of trout listeners and trout viewers after 20 years doing this in Colorado. A heavy snowstorm, being a full-on blasting low skies, and I don't mean like a gassing blizzard. I mean like a heavy one of those fall storms where the skies get real heavy and dark and the big snowflakes fall straight down. If you can stomach being on the water for that, that is a fantastic time to get trout going, and they'll get fired up. They'll be as aggressive as they ever get. There's a place that I fish every fall here in North Park, Colorado. The best day I ever had there. I've been fishing there for 15 years, every single fall. The best day I've ever had there. We never saw the sun all day. It was heavy overcast. It was the last week of October. In fact, I came home, dropped off the fishing stuff, put all the hunting stuff in, and immediately went out deer hunting. It was literally like the next day I was out deer hunting, or the next morning I left to go deer hunting. That day up in North Park was ridiculously good for trout, and it was heavy overcast, and then the snow started falling, and I fished until I couldn't stand thigh deep in the lake anymore, and that's when I finally gave up. But it was cold and heavy wet snow and just very humid out, and it was a fantastic day for trout fishing. And that was probably the best day ever in that case. That's my case study, but I've seen that same thing play out all over the place. So that can be an important one if you're a trout guy. Try to time it, put on your big boy clothes or big girl clothes, and go catch some trout when the snow starts to fall here in the West. And then the last thing I'm going to throw out, we have a lot of people that are bank anglers or kayak guys, and this is the time of year, now in early spring, when you guys can really do the best, because you're going to get a high percentage of fish that are following bait fish shallow, or that are just coming up shallow looking for the warm waters we talked about, all the things we talked about. You're going to have a bunch of fish up shallow, whether they be on boat ramps where they're easy to get to, or riprap, which is typically easy to get to, things like that. You're going to have a high percentage of them. So if you're a bank fisherman, spring and fall would be the times that I would be the most giddy about getting out and doing some fishing. And I've done a whole lot. We've had a whole resurgence in bank fishing the last 2 seasons because I get so many emails about it. And I spent like a decade, because I have a real nice Ranger boat and you get spoiled. I spent like a decade hardly ever bank fishing, and I used to bank fish all the time. And then when I did bank fish for that decade, it was, very casual, like go for a walk behind the house maybe, or go with a buddy somewhere and his kids, not a hardcore fishing trip. And for the last 2 seasons, I've gotten back into really bank fishing hard so that I have relevant information. And what I figured out is it's just like the old days when I did a lot of it. It's still a spring and fall thing for your peak times. If you're talking about reservoirs, maybe not some of the small ponds around. But I will argue this, even the small ponds are going to fish better once the weeds start dying off and you can start narrowing down where you can fish. So, again, a bit of a rambling podcast, and I apologize for that, but I do these off the cuff, and I do them because it's the season that inspires them, or it's something fresh in my mind that inspires them. But if you have an idea for a podcast, I'd love to hear it, or a TV show for that matter. YouTube topic, I would love to hear it. You can email me, Chad@fishfulthinker.com, or you can find us on social media. That's @fishfulthinker, Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok. You can send us a personal message there, a private message. I'd love to hear it, and we put it on the air if it makes sense and it's something that I think is a universal enough topic. I will absolutely put it on the air. So we would appreciate that. Also, we'd appreciate it if you check out our YouTube channel. Give us an idea for some videos for there if you want. There's pushing 700 videos on there at this point. So would be happy to produce something specifically if you guys have something you'd like to see in mind. But check that out. Please like and subscribe while you're there. Maybe tell your buddies about it. I'd appreciate that very much. And also check out World Fishing Network and Altitude Sports. We're airing on both of those multiple times every week, and we'd love to have you guys tune in and check it out. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.